This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today, I'm going to be going solo, talking about something wicked. No, not the Federal Reserve, actually, but the now movie, but what was a Broadway show. But before we dive into that, let me remind you, the Mises Institute has a special December book bundle available now. For just $25 or more, you'll receive 3 essential reads: Tom DiLorenzo's Axis of Evil, America's 3 Worst Presidents, Per Bylund's How to Think About the Economy, and Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? Support the Mises Institute and expand your library with these thought-provoking works. Claim your bundle now at Mises.org/humanaction24. That's the numerals 24. Donate $25 or more to secure this exclusive offer today. Again, you want to go to Mises.org/humanaction24. Okay, so as I say, what I want to speak to you good folks about today is, I'm sure you've seen there's been an enormous marketing blitz for this movie Wicked, and let me just give you some background to that. There was a book that was sort of a parody is not the right word, like an alternate story, or the real story of the Wizard of Oz, right? That's kind of the premise. And these things have been going around. There's some cute ones. There was one that I saw years ago about the story of the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf, but told from the wolf's perspective. All right, it was a cute little thing. But there, even though the premise was funny, whatever, the wolf was lying. Okay, so in that one, it was clear that the writers were not saying, oh, actually the wolf is the good guy and gets a bad rap. It was the wolf, just being a wolf. And so it was still a cute book. If you have little kids or something, I guess they'd have to be a little bit older to understand the irony involved and that sort of thing. But you might check it out if you're a parent. I don't remember the exact title, but I'm sure if you Googled around, you'd find that something like the story of the 3 little pigs is told from the wolf's perspective, something like that. But the book Wicked was an alternate take, and partly why I'm going over this stuff is I think it would appeal. I know a lot of viewers of the Human Action Podcast are probably into revisionist history, right? Where, oh, geez, I learned as a kid that Abraham Lincoln was a good guy, and that's not what Tom DiLorenzo thinks, right? So I'm just saying, if you're that sort of person where you at least like to consider these things, it's a very clever book, Wicked, and it shows things that, oh, actually, you've been taught that the witch from the wicked witch of the West is wicked, but actually no, she was the heroine, and it's the wizard who's the bad guy. Okay, and so it's just interesting. So they do deviate from the standard, the movie The Wizard of Oz that we've all seen a lot. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting, and you might take a look at it. And also the Broadway musical that they first made out of it, I also thought was great. All right, I'm a Les Mis fan, but Wicked is up there. And partly I'm saying this stuff because, unfortunately, the marketing for the movie and the particular actresses involved, you might think that, oh yeah, this is just some kind of woke stuff. And I haven't seen the new movie, and maybe it is. I don't know what they've done with it. And certainly the marketing, I understand why you might say, I don't want to look at that. But what I'm saying is, if you're a person who likes musicals, I encourage you to go check out the actual, musical that was on stage. And I think it still is going around. Actually, I know it is. Someone I know just went to it recently. Okay, so I'll say that. And now, though, what I really want to do in this episode is, I thought, okay, since this is topical, what many of you may not know is that there is speculation that the original Wizard of Oz, so it was first a book, and then it was itself a stage production, before then they made the movie, that we all know of as, oh yeah, that's the Wizard of Oz, that famous movie with, Somewhere Over the Rainbow and so forth. Okay, so what's interesting is there's a lot of speculation that the author of that book was, among other things, intending the story to be an allegory for the monetary debates that were raging in the United States at that time, and specifically the argument over silver versus gold. Okay, so here, just some catchphrases that you may have heard of, and that's what I'm going to do in this episode, is kind of just spell some of this stuff out to give you the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey might say. That things like William Jennings Bryan, who I'm sure you've heard of, he's an accomplished man, and I will say, when I was younger, I didn't like him, and then now the older I get, the more I do like him. He was the guy in the famous Scopes monkey trial that Clarence Darrow put on the stand and tried to humiliate him for his silly fundamentalist religious beliefs. On my own podcast recently, I have the Bob Murphy Show. I have gone through and reviewed the court transcripts, and I have argued that no, actually, William Jennings Bryan did not get humiliated on the stand, and Clarence Darrow made some basic mistakes himself. But beyond that, he was also the Secretary of State, Bryan was, under Woodrow Wilson, and he resigned in protest, saying Wilson is not being neutral. He's unnecessarily dragging the United States into this awful, European war. So that's kind of cool. But he's also known famously for his so-called Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention, where he was, saying, you won't crucify us on this cross of gold. And so what he was arguing for there was what's known as the free coinage of silver. And involved with all this is what partisans called the crime of 73, referring to legislation from 1873 that effectively ended the free coinage of silver, or you might say demonetized silver. Okay, so this is all real fascinating stuff, at least to me, that I just wanted to spell out. But just to circle back on the Wizard of Oz angle, so some of the connections. So for one thing, the yellow brick road, right? That they got that, and then in the original book, and I think the original stage production, but I'm not certain about that, Dorothy's shoes were silver. Okay, in the movie that we've all seen, they're ruby red. But my understanding is that was just because that stood out more. Like that was, in terms of having a visually appealing movie, that having those red slippers that, you could have gone home whenever you wanted. The power was always here. It's clear that it's her slippers that are the salvation for Dorothy, not going to, not following the Yellow Brick Road and going to the wizard, who even in the movie we know, let alone the subsequent book Wicked and so forth, the Wizard of Oz is not a good guy, right? He's a fraud. And he's, besides just the obvious, like, hey, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, he's just putting on a big show to fool everybody and solidify his political power. Beyond that, though, just think about what a jerk this guy is. That he's got this young girl who shows up, her house falls on one of his enemies, and then he's still got this other enemy who's now, angry at this girl for killing her sister. And what does the wizard do? He says, oh, I can help you, but I need you to go kill this witch first for me. What kind of a grown man asks a young girl, go murder someone for me? You can maybe say it's not murder. Go kill somebody, put it that way. And then I'll help you. Like, who does that? Well, the Wizard of Oz, that's who. Okay. And so anyway, that's, so part of the story in terms of people interpreting it and saying that, yes, Frank Baum, the author, was trying to make the case for silver in a subtle allegorical way, is to say that, yeah, the Wizard of Oz was not your salvation. It was, following the Yellow Brick Road was not what Dorothy needed to do. The whole time she had the silver shoes on her feet right there. She had, the power was hers all along. Okay, so there's that element. And then also the Wizard of Oz, and people speculate that, OZ is ounces, right? Ounces of silver and gold. All right, so that's, if you want to see more here, I'm just touching on some of the obvious points that the people who make this case bring up. But you could just even look at the Wikipedia entry on this stuff, and it'll talk about, the monetary economics in the Wizard of Oz theories. Okay, so having said all that, now let me just come back to the economics and U.S. history element of it. So here I'm going to rely on, I think it was chapter 2 of my book from the Mises Institute, Understanding Money Mechanics. And if you haven't looked at that, I would encourage you, if the stuff I'm talking about in this episode interests you, because I learned some stuff here when I did the research to write this chapter specifically on the early monetary history of the United States. And I had known for years about, there was the dollar used to be backed up by gold. Everybody knows that. And that's why we're mad at Nixon and then earlier FDR. And then, there was some stuff about it was silver too for a while. And probably most of you are a little bit hazy on how did that work. So I spell all that stuff out, from first principles and not getting too deep into it. So it's a pretty quick read. As I say, if you just even want to check out just this early chapter in the book, and it's free PDF as everything is that's published by the Mises Institute. So again, that's my book, Understanding Money Mechanics. If you just Google Robert Murphy, Understanding Money Mechanics, you'll see the PDF that you can get. So that's what let me just read a little bit from that here, and then I'll spend the balance of this episode of the Human Action Podcast just elaborating on what I'm going to read here. So these are excerpts from my book, Understanding Money Mechanics. So I first started out and said how since the U.S., the original 13 colonies were part of the British Empire, originally their money officially was Great Britain's money, pounds, shillings, and pence. And at the time, Great Britain was on a silver standard. Okay, and if you just think about like the pound sterling, like that's the the term we use for the British currency. That's going back to the days of it was a physical weight of the metal, right? The pound, it was pound sterling, right? And so what I'm partly going over here is to explain. You may think that back in the days of hard money, all the major powers were on gold, and you might just think that it was always gold. And I'm saying that no, actually. There was a period where silver was actually the money of the advanced nations. Okay. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued unbacked paper money called continental currencies. It had, that led to rampant price inflation, and you may have heard the expression "not worth a continental," right? So that's where that comes from. That once the price inflation got out of hand, people didn't want the continental currency. Okay. And then among the foreign coins circulating among the American colonists, the most popular was the Spanish silver dollar. And this made the term dollar common in the colonies, explaining why the continental currency was denominated in dollars, right? Rather than shilling or pence or whatever. And so it wasn't the Spanish gold dollar, it was the Spanish silver dollar that is what made American colonists start using that term dollar in commerce and thinking in terms of dollars being their money. And then that, again, is why once U.S. officials, either, the colonial governments or then later the country, the new republic, that's why they use that term dollar for what their currency was. Or I should say their money, right? Because currency is a more specific term. Okay, and so here I want to read something. It is crucial for today's readers to understand that from the inception of the modern, by which I mean the post-Constitution, United States in the late 1780s, through the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the federal government issued money only in the form of gold and silver coins. Okay, and there was a borderline exception in the War of 1812 where they had some treasury notes that were quasi-money. Okay, but besides that border case, my point is it's not that the federal government in the early days, again, from the foundation of the Constitution, with George Washington being the first president in that scenario, that's what we're talking about, that regime, if you will, up through the eve of the Civil War, or the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression, if you're a Tom DiLorenzo fan. My point is, in that period, you may have thought that, oh yeah, they issued, U.S. paper currency issued by the federal government, but it was backed up by gold or maybe silver somewhere. Whereas, FDR removed that backing up and then Nixon finally, and I'm saying no. When we say that in the beginning, dollars were gold and or silver, I don't just mean there was green pieces of paper that were backed up somewhere with gold and silver in a vault. No, the U.S. government, again, to repeat, did not issue paper currency at all in this period. What would happen is they defined what the weight in terms of either silver or gold was for a dollar. And then if people had, quote, raw gold or silver, they could bring it to the mint and it would be stamped into official coins. Legal tender, this is what we mean by official U.S. dollars, is their coins of silver or gold with the appropriate, statutorily specified weight, in terms of like grains. All right, I'll get to the numbers in a minute, but I'm just first explaining how the thing worked. All right, so it's not that the authorities determined the money supply. No, that was endogenously determined. If you know what that word means, it was a market outcome, if you will. Right, just like the authorities don't determine how many barrels of oil get produced each year. Likewise, the authorities in this early period did not determine how many dollars are we going to print, because again, the authorities weren't even printing dollars, period. It was just they said the dollar is defined as either this amount of gold or this amount of silver, and if you bring that amount of gold or silver to the mint, we will turn it into official coinage at the appropriate ratios or weights. Okay, so just think through the implications of how far we've come from that. Okay, so what probably many of you think of as, oh yeah, back during the days of hard money under the gold standard, even that was a much weaker version of hard money than what we're talking about here. There, in that period where the U.S. government was issuing paper greenbacks that you could redeem for specie, right? That, again, was a one step weaker than what we're talking about here, where the actual official money, according to the government, were gold and silver coins. Now, to be clear, I'm going back to quoting here, in this early period, commercial banks were allowed to issue their own paper notes that were redeemable in hard money, and to the extent that they were trusted, might circulate in the community along with full-bodied coins. But these banknotes were not the same thing, economically or legally, as gold and silver dollars. Okay, in summary, for the first 70-odd years after the modern federal government's creation, official U.S. dollars consisted in actual gold and silver coins that regular people carried in their pockets and spent at the store. Indeed, so bad was the constitutional framers' experience with the continental currency that they included in the contract clause of the Constitution the prohibition that, quote, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. All right, so I'm just giving some of the background there. Okay, now let's get to the numbers. In the Coinage Act of 1792, the U.S. dollar was defined as either 371.25 grains of pure silver or 24.75 grains of pure gold. Okay, so again, it's not saying the dollar is a paper note that's backed up by either of those two numbers. No, it's saying the definition, right? It's like, and here when it says like the Congress shall have power to coin money, it wasn't set and to regulate the value thereof, right? So a lot of people point to that as constitutional authority for the Federal Reserve and for the fiat paper money that the authorities produce. And there is I think, correct school of thought that says, no, not at all. That's not what they were doing. All they were doing in the original Constitution when it came to the federal government being able to regulate the value thereof of the coinage of the money was just in their capacity as like setting weights and measures, right? So just like if people wrote contracts promising, oh, I'm going to sell you this many yards of fabric and then somebody gives, a certain number of feet, and they say, oh, well, what I meant by a yard was 4 feet, or they would say 2 feet, right, to undersell and to underdeliver. And say, yeah, that's what I meant by a yard, right? So the courts would need to know, they have some official measure of what do these terms mean if they're like in a contract and somebody owes, there's 12 inches in a foot, there's 3 feet in a yard, and so forth, in terms of weights and whatnot, right? Just for the enforcement of contracts and just for the rule of law to exist. And so likewise, that was the function here when they were saying, if there's a contract saying you owe somebody, if you have a debt instrument, you owe somebody $10, $10 US, what does that mean? How can you satisfy that? And saying, oh, what it means is, and again, this original Coinage Act of 1792, the dollar is either 371.25 grains of pure silver or 24.75 grains of pure gold. Okay, and the reason they picked those particular numbers, if you do the arithmetic, that established a gold-silver ratio of precisely 15 to 1, right? That you needed 15 times as many grains of pure silver to count as a dollar as you did grains of pure gold, right? So that gold had a value 15 times higher than silver under this original definition. All right, I'm going to go back to reading now, quoting for myself. Part of the rationale for this policy of bimetallism, right? So that's a BI in the front, so meaning like just like bi-weekly, that kind of usage. So bimetallism means the U.S. at this point was on 2 different metallic standards. It was both a gold standard and a silver standard. Okay, so why did they have this policy of bimetallism? Was that silver coins were convenient for small denominations, including fractions such as a $50, a $25, and so forth. And that's where we get the terms like, oh, here's a quarter, here's a dime, so on. While gold coins were preferable for larger denominations. And so what they had in practice is they're really, in the beginning, were just silver dollars, the coins, right? There was no such thing as in the beginning, as a single coin that was made of gold that was stamped $1. No, the coins were eagles, right? And so a $10 eagle and a $20 double eagle. Okay, whereas it was the silver that was used for the smaller amounts, and that made sense, right? Just physically, because to only have $1 worth of gold wouldn't be that much gold. And so, there wouldn't be that much. I mean, by the way, they weren't made of the pure metal, right? Wouldn't work, right? You would also put in baser metal just to make the coin sturdy and, they could pass around in commerce. But my point is, in the beginning, partly the reason they had both gold and silver is because they thought the demands of commerce, it can't just be one or the other. If you just had a pure silver standard, then large transactions, it would be difficult. You would need a bunch of coins, a high weight of silver to buy something expensive. But on the other hand, it couldn't just be gold coins, because then for smaller transactions, the amount of gold you would need to hand over would be too small, and it would be impractical to have a coin that just had that limit. Okay, you get the idea. So that's why they did that. And then the reason they originally picked that 15 to 1 ratio was in 1792 when they were codifying this. That happened to be roughly the global market exchange rate between gold and silver. Okay, so they weren't just pulling that number out of the air. They were trying to make it so that they were fairly codifying, oh yeah, this is the actual relative valuation of gold versus silver, and we're going to distill that down into our statute. Okay, but the problem is, so here I'm reading, however, the problem with bimetallism is the phenomenon known as Gresham's law, summarized in the aphorism, bad money drives out good. Specifically, when a government defines a currency in terms of both silver and gold, unless the implied value ratio of the two metals is close to the actual market exchange rate, one of the metals will necessarily be overvalued while the other is undervalued, and people then only spend the overvalued metal while hoarding or melting or sending abroad the undervalued metal. Okay, so what happened, originally things were fine because, again, they picked the legal ratios to correspond roughly to what the market ratio was. But then over time, I'm just reading again, increased silver production relative to gold led to a gradual erosion of the world price of silver, right? So more silver was being mined and brought into circulation than gold. And so over time, silver's value relative to gold slipped in terms of actual market exchange rates, moving the actual market ratio closer to 15.5 to 1, right? So silver or gold originally was 15 times more valuable than silver on a per weight basis. And then its premium rose to about 15.5 to 1. Okay. And so then as that happened, the rules were still in place in terms of you bring gold or silver to the U.S. Mint, we're going to stamp it into gold or silver coins according to these ratios. So now if silver in terms of the official ratio is being relatively overvalued, you're only going to bring your silver to get turned into coins. And you'd be foolish to bring your gold to the mint and have that stamped into gold coins, because that's locking it in now. If you're going to spend it as dollars rather than holding it as the raw metal, you're losing out. Okay. And so as Rothbard says, from 1810 until 1834, only silver coins circulated in the United States. And again, this is what Gresham's law refers to. I want to be clear, just if I can go off on an aside for a moment. I think sometimes people, even in the free market community, misunderstand what Gresham's law is saying. And so, for example, they might say things like, oh yeah, you can't have a free market currency. That will never work because, hey, Gresham's law says bad money drives out good. And so you can't trust market forces to produce money because some competitor will come along and produce, a shoddier type of money, and that will drive out all the good money. No, Gresham's law is in the context of government mandates forcing people to accept it as a payment of legal, of debts, illegal tender laws. Okay, so the idea is, if you owed somebody contractually because, you borrowed money from them and they have an IOU that you issued, or you have a bond or whatever, a mortgage, if you owe somebody things that contractually are denominated in US dollars, and then the government is saying, as far as the court system is concerned, we will say you have satisfied your debt if you pay the dollars either with silver, with a conversion to dollars in terms of this ratio, or gold. And then that ratio that they're announcing implied that gold was only 15 times more valuable than silver. But in reality, in the market, gold is 15.5 times more valuable. Then the idea is you're just going to pay your debts off using silver coin, because it's actually, overvaluing what it's really worth, or the other way around. The amount of your dollar debt that you think you should be knocking down by handing over an ounce of gold, the court system is going to say, no, we only think, your dollar debt should have been reduced by this amount, because this is how we value, this is the implicit price, the dollar price of gold that we're using. Okay, so that's maybe another way of thinking about it. Okay, so that's what Gresham law is saying. If it weren't for government rules forcing merchants to accept gold and silver coins according to certain ratios, if their prices are posted in the store in the form of dollars, and even, more specifically, the extinguishing of debts denominated in dollars, then Gresham's law wouldn't matter, right? It's not like Americans had to use Zimbabwe currency because, bad money drives out good, and that's why Zimbabwe currency flooded our markets a few years ago, and we had no choice but to buy everything in terms of, no, nobody just accepts it because that's a cruddy currency. I don't mean to use foul language so close to Christmas, right? And why is that? Because the Zimbabwean government had no authority over us to force Americans to accept their worthless currency. Okay, but Americans back at this time, they were under legal rules and court system and property titles and such, saying that if somebody hands you over this many silver coins, then that they're good. We're as far as we're concerned, they paid off their debt. All right, so that's why, it was a de facto silver standard. And Mises has some quote somewhere saying, in practice, a bimetallic standard refers to alternating monometallic standards. And we'll get into that here in a second. The Coinage Acts of 1834 and 1837 revised the implied content of the gold dollar down to 23.22 grains of pure gold, while leaving the silver dollar at 371.25 grains. Because there are 480 grains in a troy ounce, these definitions of the metallic content of the dollar implied a gold price of approximately $20.67 per ounce. So that might sound familiar to you if you've read a little bit in terms of the classical gold standard. That was the number, before FDR came in and devalued things. Okay, so again, it was it wasn't the original Coinage Act of 1792. No, it was the Coinage Acts of 1834 and 1837 that refined the gold content of the dollar, and that ended up sticking. Okay, and an unchanged silver price of approximately $1.29. Okay, so now if you do that arithmetic, you realize, it went from gold being roughly 15 times, or exactly 15 times more valuable than silver in the original 1792 legislation, to now when they revised it, now gold is just a hair under 16 to 1. But so now they just did the flip side of the same problem, right? So before, because the market rate was about 15.5 to 1, when gold was only 15 times more valuable than silver, everyone just used silver in the U.S. But then when they revised it to make gold more like 16 to 1, it flipped, and now everyone just used gold. Okay? And so, as I say here, the U.S., though still officially committed to a bimetallic standard, after 1834 flipped from a de facto silver standard to a de facto gold standard. Okay, and then let me just jump ahead. The classical gold standard refers to the period beginning in the late 19th century when a growing number of countries tied their currencies to gold. Because the process was gradual, it's difficult to state precisely when the period began. And here I'm quoting from a historian. In 1873, there were some 9 countries on the gold standard. In 1890, 22 countries. And by 1900, 29 countries. And finally, in 1912, 49 countries. All right, these were all ones that officially were tying their sovereign domestic, money to a specific weight of gold. And it was kind of a snowball process and a network effect. As more and more countries were doing that, it made more sense for the remainders to, get off silver and flip over to gold if that's what they'd been doing. And so everyone, again, by 1912, the eve of the First World War, 49 countries all officially were defining their currencies in specific weights of gold. And that's what we mean as the classical gold standard period. Okay, this is back to me. Recall from the previous section that going into the Civil War, the U.S. dollar was defined in grains of the precious metals that implied a mint price of either $20.67 per troy ounce of gold or of $1.29 per troy ounce of silver for a gold-silver ratio of about 16 to 1. And because world prices of gold and silver were closer to 15.5 to 1, there was little incentive to bring silver to the U.S. Mint for conversion into coins. And here's the critical thing. Consequently, there was little opposition in 1873 when Congress discontinued the free coinage of the standard silver dollar, as there had been little demand for the option. Okay? So again, just don't understand, because of the relative overvaluation of gold, for decades, nobody had been bothering to try to turn their raw silver into silver coins because it was the official price was undervaluing it. Silver, put it this way, the market price of silver measured in U.S. dollars was higher than $1.29 per troy ounce. So if you took your raw silver to the mint and had it physically transformed into coins, stamped as $1 or a $0.25 or whatever, that would be worth less than the bullion price of the raw metal. So you would be silly to do it. So nobody was taking advantage of that option. And so in 1873, the government officially discontinued. They had actually earlier in 1853 discontinued like dimes and quarters, but up until 1873, you still officially had the option, the right to take raw silver in and have it turned into $1 silver coins. But then in 1873, that last vestige of the silver standard was discontinued. Okay, but at the time, nobody really protested because no one had been doing it for decades. It was uneconomical, right? So back to my narrative here. However, later in the decade of the 1870s, when world silver prices dropped, and that was partly as a result of silver discoveries and partly as a result of other countries demonetizing silver, particularly the German Empire, the change of policy would be viewed in a different light. Indeed, pro-silver interests eventually referred to the momentous event as the crime of 73. Okay, so again, what was happening was all along, the government was basically saying, they didn't do it in these terms, but in terms of the grain definitions, it implied that the U.S. was valuing silver officially at $1.29 per troy ounce. And so when the world price of silver was higher than that, it didn't really matter. They discontinued that option. And then because there were more silver discoveries, and then as other countries around the world left the silver standard and went to a pure gold standard, that reduced the demand for silver in those other countries. And so now there was like a glut of silver, so that pushed down the market price of silver below $1.29. And so now if the U.S. government is saying, hey, if you show up and bring raw silver, we'll stamp it into official U.S. coinage at the rate of $1.29 per troy ounce of silver that you bring to us, and the global price of silver is lower than that, now there's an arbitrage opportunity. But oops, once that happened, everyone realized, oh, wait a minute, back in 1873, they took away that option from us. Okay, and so that was the controversy, and that's why people were outraged. I'll just read one last thing here. There was much drama in the battle between silver and gold interests, most notably William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech, which called for a return to bimetallism and the free coinage of silver is a method of helping the indebted farmers at the expense of the Wall Street elites. And he delivered that at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, where he was nominated for president. Yet, Bryan lost the general election to the pro-gold Republican William McKinley, who signed the Gold Standard Act of 1900 into law. This legislation codified the definition of the gold dollar that had been established back in 1837, which we recall implied a dollar gold price of about $20.67 per ounce. This was the dollar's gold content throughout the classical gold standard period and would prevail until FDR's devaluation in 1933/34, which, I explain later in the chapter. Okay, so let me just spell out a few things here. Number one, you may have thought that the Rothbardian tradition in Austrian libertarianism, Austro-libertarianism, I should say, we're big fans of William McKinley and the Gold Standard Act of 1900 because, hey, we like hard money, right? And we're big fans of gold. And we think if the government just got out of the way that the market would return to gold. And Rothbard and Mises both wrote things talking about how could the U.S. go back to hard money, and it involved tying the dollar back to gold and, different proposals and what ratio should we use and that sort of thing. So you may have thought that Murray Rothbard himself thought this was a great thing, and that Gold Standard Act of 1900, and I really like McKinley and all his background. And no, if you go read the various places where Rothbard talks about this stuff, I think he tells the story in different ways in various of his works, but it's I don't want to oversell it, but it's almost like in Rothbard's narrative, the pro-gold people are the bad guys, like, right, in terms of like the bankers and such, and they had different factions, and the people who were pushing for the Gold Standard Act are not the heroes in Rothbard's narrative. And so it's very interesting. And I was actually surprised when I first read Rothbard's stuff, because back then I didn't fully understand, and I didn't really get the whole bimetallic thing and whatever. I just didn't know enough of the history. And so anyway, I was actually surprised by that. I had assumed going into it that Rothbard was going to be a champion of the pro-gold people since he liked hard money. And that's not what was going on. And in retrospect, it's not surprising, right? Because to be pro-gold doesn't necessarily mean you want the U.S. federal government intervening and doing things, right? You really, if you're a Rothbardian, you want the government to not exist. And then to say nothing about money or banking. All right. So anyway, there's that interesting element there. But also, let me just explain what was going on with the people wanting the free coinage of silver and the return to bimetallism, and how would it be that the free coinage of silver would help the farmers, right? So the idea was a bunch of the farmers had mortgaged their property, right? So they went to the banks, they pledged their farms as collateral and got loans. So the loans are denominated in dollars, of course. And who owns the loans? Well, the fat cats on Wall Street, to paint with a broad brush, right? The moneyed interests, the capitalists. Okay, so if you're a populist like Bryan, who are you going to favor there? You're going to favor the indebted farmers, the salt of the earth, the people who, are raising a family and taking them to Sunday school and such, not the guys on Wall Street with their top hats. And so once global silver prices had dropped below the $1.29 threshold, if you allowed for the resumption of the free coinage of silver, that would effectively be very inflationary, right? A bunch of people would take raw silver that they could purchase for less than $1.29, take it to the mint, have it turned into official U.S. coinage with an official rate, of $1.29 per troy ounce of silver, and then use that to, for example, go pay the interest or the principal on their debts. Okay, so it was basically a way. So, there's different ways you can think about it, that you could take raw silver that had a market value that you could obtain, by selling your eggs or, milk or whatever. You could get raw silver at less than $1.29, then have it turned into official U.S. coinage and use that to pay down the dollar debt that you owed the bank. Or you can also think of it equivalently as, by allowing for the resumption of the free coinage of silver, now, again, it's not that the authorities determined the money supply. It was an endogenous outcome based on what the public did. And so now if you're opening up the floodgates and allowing people to bring their raw silver and to be turned into official U.S. dollars, that's effectively inflating the money supply. It's expanding the total quantity of U.S. dollars in existence. So other things equal, what's that going to do? It's going to push up prices. It's going to devalue the dollar. And so if you're a debtor, other things equal, and there's an unexpected devaluation of the dollar in real terms, that makes it easier for you, especially if you're a farmer who's selling, goods that people need. You're selling milk and eggs and beef and whatnot. Then a general inflation is going to help you, right? Because the prices of the eggs and whatever respond to the increasing quantity of dollars in existence, but your debt is fixed, right? It's not that they had an inflation, purchasing power clauses in the mortgages on the farm back then. Okay. So that's the idea. I'm just explaining the mechanics of it, and why would it be that if you were a populist in 1896, that you would want the resumption of the free coinage of silver in order to help the indebted farmers and to stick it to those fat cats on Wall Street and the guys who own the banks, right? That's the idea. Okay, so again, if you're interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to go check out my book, Understanding Money Mechanics. It makes a great Christmas gift as well. You can get the physical book. And either way, thanks for your attention, everybody. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.